This week's episode of Fresh Corduroy is with Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser. I asked AG Weiser to come on the podcast to discuss several issues that face ski towns not only across Colorado, but across the U.S. Namely, a housing shortage making living and working in these towns unaffordable. We also talk about climate change and how that impacts the ski industry, and what Colorado is doing at the state level to mitigate the impact. We also discuss the importance of water rights and the impact that may or may not have on the snowmaking capabilities of ski areas. And finally, how Colorado and his office works to protect access to public lands, which makes up the majority of land that ski resorts operate on. This episode is a little different than others, but I think they are worthy topics to cover. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section to this episode. And with that, let's get some fresh corduroy with Attorney General Phil Weiser. All right, we're back for another episode of Fresh Corduroy. Today's guest is Attorney General of Colorado, Phil Weiser. Attorney General, welcome to Fresh Corduroy.
Craig, it's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. Thank you for being on. This may be the wonkiest podcast that I will host yet. Certainly is as of the current crop. But I think it's really interesting that the people who love skiing and snowboarding are faced with an environment that is a microcosm of larger societal problems. And I think it's interesting that we talk about them today. But first and foremost, what is the Phil Weiser skiing origin story?
Like many people who grew up back east, Hunter Mountain is where I learned to ski on ice. And I didn't know in high school that there was powder, because when you go to Hunter Mountain, as those who know, it's crowded, it's icy. It's not the most pleasant experience, but I did have a love for skiing. And my dad was wonderful in taking me. I had a glimpse. I was an exchange student in Switzerland in high school. And in my first year of college, I went out during a winter break to ski in Switzerland. And it was a revelation, because my experience on powder was a first. And I will admit that I never learned to ski the right way. So my format is unfortunately unconventional, might be a nice way to put it, but adjacent to good form. I've taken skiing lessons later in life, but my kids grew up in Colorado. I was able to give them the real deal, and it was important to my wife and I, adopted Coloradans. They're growing up in Colorado. They learn how to ski. I'm now serving as Attorney General in our state as an adopted Coloradan, and like most people here, I do love our mountains, and I do love skiing.
That's great. And how often do you get to go skiing today?
So you're really rubbing salt in my wounds. Here we are in April, and I thought this year that I would buy a 4-pack. If you buy it early, you get 5, and I bought it for me and both my kids. I will be candid. I've gone skiing once this year, and I wasn't able to take my kids at all. And so if you are a Coloradan and you love going skiing with your kids, then you know how much that pains me. It's a reality. My kids are older, they're really busy, and that my job has a bit going on right now. So I have not gotten a good year at all, even though the snow when I went one day was extraordinary and had a great experience. I love it. One thing about skiing, Craig, which is great, and I know a lot of people ski probably can relate to this, it does focus the mind. And it quiets the mind in a way that I find healthy, thoroughly enjoyable. It's a unique experience. I love doing it. I clerked for Justice Byron White, who skied until he was in his 80s. And Justice White used to have reunions of his clerks' ski trips, because that was so meaningful to him, and I was able to go on a couple of those. I will say my one-time skiing this year is not a reflection of how much I love to ski, but a reflection of my schedule.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to maybe make some campaign stops at ski areas and get multitask. You get some skiing in and campaign simultaneously.
Well, I am campaigning to be Colorado's next governor, and that means wherever I can earn votes, I will. And yes, you're right, the slopes are promising, although it's tough because when you're on the slopes, you never know, where someone's from. And so you're doing your best to build a relationship, and the person's like, oh, yeah, I live in New York or whatever. So,
Yeah. Well, obviously, the chairlift rides are where you can have a one-on-one conversation or one on 4 or 6, depending on the size of the lift.
well, and this is actually worth knowing. I'm afraid to bring my smartphone out on a chairlift. I know some people do, and I'm like, that's an accident waiting to happen that I don't need to happen. So I do like talking to people on chairlifts, and it's one of the environments where people can get to know each other and meet people you wouldn't otherwise meet. That's always been a fun part of the experience for me as well.
Yeah, it's great. And I know, obviously, given your role, you may not be able to choose, but what is your favorite Colorado ski resort?
All right. I don't want to get in trouble because I feel like when people ask me this, like, what's your favorite part of Colorado? I often will say, you're asking me to choose between my kids. So what I will say, because I know we have people from across the U.S., many of whom haven't yet skied in Colorado.
And internationally.
And internationally. Colorado skiing, Colorado mountain towns are extraordinary. And I unfortunately haven't ever skied at Telluride or Crested Butte. I've been there a lot in the summers, and there's a great saying, by the way, you come to Colorado for the winters and the skiings, but you stay for the summers, because these mountains in the summer, for the hikes and for the experience, are spectacular. All right, so what I will give up, because I want to give you an answer, the 5-pack I purchased was at Copper, which has become a place I have gone recently with my kids, because they ended up getting a program there they have called Copper Choppers, where you can actually put your kids on a bus, they go to Copper, they learn how to ski. So that's where I've defaulted to, but I don't want to say that means Copper is my favorite per se, because you really can't go wrong. There's so many great places with different types of experiences.
All right. Well, next season, hopefully I'll make it to Colorado, and we'll find a place that we can go skiing together.
You're on.
Terrific. All right. Let's talk about some of the issues that face the skiing industry, writ large. One of the things that is not specific to Colorado, it's specific. It happens in all resort towns across the country, and frankly, more broadly, not just resort towns per se, as housing crisis. Affordability and availability is a big issue in resort towns. I was in Steamboat a prior season, and they have a big issue with like first responders having to live 45 minutes to an hour outside of Steamboat Springs. They recently had their housing authority try and get a large affordable housing development through, and that was voted down just recently. Vail has had issues in terms of developing employee housing, and the town of Vail has done something different. How does a resort town, or more broadly, overcome some of these challenges? Well, let's talk about the challenge. I think A, there's a crisis, right? There's a shortage, and then B, how do you resolve that problem?
When I travel around Colorado, Steamboat Springs is one that I have had that conversation. I hear what you said, and it scares me. If you are a law enforcement officer in Steamboat Springs, chances are you're living in Craig, an hour away, which means if there's a public safety emergency in Steamboat Springs and law enforcement officers are an hour away in Craig, their ability to respond is compromised, to say the least. That is not good for public safety. It's also not good because my vision of policing is very much a community policing model where police officers build relationships in the communities they serve, which comes from obviously being on the job, but also comes from being a coach of the basketball team, or it comes from being a friend or a neighbor. And when you live an hour away, you don't have that. The models that are being tested are a range of employee housing ideas. So that means the municipality or the ski resort will find ways to build housing that employees can afford. And that is something which is getting started. The other challenge we have to look at is, and I'm looking at this intensively now, what are the barriers on the supply side to building more housing? Because we don't have enough of it. And this is true for teachers or nurses as well. And we need a lot of creativity on housing. Let me give you an example of a way we were in our office able to bring this mindset to bear. I went to southern Colorado, not ski resort country, but an important part of our state, and heard about a specific housing problem there. There's a lot of housing that is blighted, that may have people who are drug users living in it, and the housing itself is becoming weighing down the community, and they need more housing. And they said, "What can you do about it?" I said, "Let me think about this." And I got back to the office, and it turns out we had this fund, a settlement fund from suing the big banks for the mortgage foreclosure mess, and it's dedicated to housing. And I said, how much of that money, $60 million was the total, was sent and used south of Pueblo, which is the, call it, southern third or so of our state? The answer, none. They said, well, the programs we have don't work in this area. This is a problem. Like the programs that work in like Metro Denver may not work in Steamboat Springs, Pagosa Springs, or Trinidad. I said, we got to create a new program. We did. It's called the Colorado Partnership for Education and Rural Revitalization, or COPR. And we worked with community colleges to train people to rehabilitate existing housing stock to get back into circulation. So far in Trinidad, I think they've now done 7 homes, and they're graduating people from each of these 4 community colleges equipped to do the incredibly important work of rehabilitating these homes. That's one model of one creative solution. We need lots of models and lots of solutions. This is a real issue, and it's a real threat.
One of the challenges or complaints that an outsider might have is that things move too slowly, right? So Steamboat, I know the proposal was on the books for a long time. It went through the city council and voted up and voted down, and ultimately a public referendum. It takes months, and obviously it was just voted down, so it'll take longer for anything to actually occur, for shovel to go into the ground. Vail was similar in the sense that there was a different property that Vail Resorts wanted to develop. The town voted that down and then ultimately developed something else. Real estate development is just, by its nature, it can take a while, but oftentimes different aspects weigh it down even further. How do you, if the challenge is here and present today, how do you speed things up? Whether it's from the government's perspective, permitting, zoning, environmental regulation, like there's a slew of different things that, while all well-intentioned, can oftentimes act as a roadblock to solving the challenge that's at hand.
This is the conversation we need to have as a society, and I want Colorado to be a leader in how we do this. How do we enable building to be done more quickly and cheaper so we have more housing options? And what we need to do is create a spirit of problem solving and a community of practice. We need the leaders from Vail, from Steamboat, from Telluride, from Grand Junction, all across our state, because many of these communities are adjacent. So if you're in Rifle and you're building housing that someone can work in Vail, that's part of the solution. And this is a sense of regionalism that we need to have, so that we're thinking about this in a regional way and that we're using a range of solutions. Habitat for Humanity has been doing some very interesting building of new housing on the western slope. We need to learn, how's that working? How can we help? And it's got to be a partnership between the state and the local governments. I don't want our state government bigfooting local government saying you have to do it just this exact way, because what works in Rifle or in Vail may be different than what works in Telluride or Ouray or Steamboat Springs. And so we need to make sure that we're learning together how to solve these challenges and putting a spotlight on the challenge you have to solve. Let me mention one other issue, Craig, that is out there too, which is mobile home parks. A lot of the workers who may work at resorts or work at the restaurants, they're working and on a tough budget, and they're living sometimes at a mobile home park, which is often the most affordable housing options in communities like Steamboat Springs or Fort Collins or anywhere across our state. We've had some laws in Colorado to protect mobile home park residents so they're not going to get squeezed because they have made their investment living in a mobile home park. In theory, their home is one they could pick up and take somewhere else, but in practice, that often isn't the case. So we need to make sure they're treated properly, make sure they're given the services that they're promised. That's an area our office has actually gotten involved with over the last few years as well.
Interesting. There's I haven't thought about it in many years, but if I remember correctly, there's a mobile home park not far from Aspen, and you're right. It's the local workers reside there, and it's the most affordable place to live in Pitkin County. It is Pitkin County. It's been a while since I've been there, but that is an affordable option that if you're an owner of a mobile home development, it's possible that you would sell the land out from underneath the residents for some better return on that investment. So I can see how that's important, and or frankly, that's another it perhaps is a viable option as a perhaps short-term fix to the longer-term problem, which is bring in manufactured housing to a spot and solve for 30 or 40 families in the short term. I don't know if that's a viable option, but then there's the NIMBYism.
Well, NIMBYism is something that obviously, if you take this to the extreme, you build no mobile home parks, you build no duplex, triplexes, or other more dense housing options. And part of what we obviously need is different forms of housing density that people can afford in communities that we know are more and more expensive. And the pandemic obviously made this more challenging because in many of these communities in Colorado, it got more expensive to live in Summit County, where Copper is located, or in Aspen, Pitkin County, as you noted, or in Garfield County, which is a next door county to Pitkin. So we need to make sure we're exploring all these options for how we develop affordable places for people to live, and we're working on that in Colorado. It's got to be a conversation that we continue to have a focus on. There's a state ballot proposition called Proposition 123 to provide housing needs assessments for every county to evaluate and to develop a plan. And if the state can work with, support, and help, again, create that sense of urgency, I think we can do great things here in Colorado. There's certainly a need, and I know that people recognize we got to do some things differently.
You mentioned urban density or density of housing stock. Oftentimes, well, look, as a New York City resident, I know density, and there are great attributes to it, and then there's obviously some downsides to it. Some of those attributes, the great attributes, is that you can walk as opposed to have to get in a car and drive. You have a perhaps tighter sense of community, albeit New York City, sometimes you don't talk to your neighbors, but there is this, the density leads to other efficiencies, i.e. Running utilities and the other infrastructure, the roads, the shopping locations. For some of these places that we've talked about, density in that context is almost a foreign concept, but it's important to understand the infrastructure and also to think about it. Today's infrastructure of these towns and communities may not be able to support the growth of the population that we're talking about. So, maybe as Attorney General, this isn't necessarily your bailiwick, but as a potential governor of the state, the infrastructure of the communities themselves needs to be thought about and planned for the population growth. So how do you think about those things in terms of urban design more broadly?
Craig, you put your finger on it. In my day job as Attorney General, I've not had as much direct exposure, but as I think about serving Colorado's governor, this is something that is top of mind. And frankly, when I show up as Attorney General, I hear about it a lot. The phrase that I believe in is smart growth, which is we're growing in Colorado. I want us to grow. We need to grow. How do we grow smartly? And you put your finger on it. Density, and you hear this phrase sometimes, transit-oriented communities. You want to design your communities in a way that will enable people to live in places they can afford. Steamboat Springs, we've talked about a few times, they've actually done some really smart work on housing that they've built, which is more dense for employees. And a lot of businesses now, including major resorts, have to ask, where are our employees going to live? And then the communities have to say, where are other service workers going to live? Because for people who work at the restaurants or in the hotels, they need to live somewhere. And it's not healthy from many perspectives to have people living an hour or more away. And so how we figure out the design of these communities is critical. How we look for places where we can have housing development is critical. And the answer is going to be different in different communities. But we're not going to evade this issue because these areas are popular for good reason. We need to make sure that we can give people a chance to live in places they work, because if you don't, it does have really adverse consequences for communities.
Yeah, and more broadly, touch on, I think every skier in Colorado complains about I-70 and getting to the mountains on the weekends. It's not just the community; it's statewide in terms of the infrastructure and thoughtfulness, and it extends into other things that we'll touch on momentarily in the environmental sector. Charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and do you have a network of charging that allows them to traverse the state effectively and efficiently? So how do you think about it from a holistic statewide perspective?
Well, now is a good time to acknowledge what is critical for this whole conversation, which is the fact that our climate is changing. And when you look at climate change in a holistic manner, there are a number of points that come up. First, as we've been talking about, I said it wasn't healthy. I talked before about from a public safety perspective, but from a climate perspective, you don't want people driving an hour each way to their job. It's not good from a carbon emission standpoint. It's not good from congestion on the road standpoint. We need to be smarter about how we design people's lives so that people are living closer to transportation that is accessible, that is going to help us be more resilient. And part of that relates to where people live. So housing, transportation, and climate are not distinct, they're related. Also related here is wildfire risk and water, both of which relates to climate as well. And so I think about these as interrelated, and a challenge for us in Colorado at the local and the regional level to make sure we're setting up transportation networks, housing opportunities, how we manage our water, how we protect our forests in a sustainable and resilient way. And one of the challenges has been from a public policy perspective, and you warned your listeners this would be wonky, so here goes. We in the United States of America have worked hard to be more efficient how we deliver goods and services. And we at times have focused on how we are being more equitable so that everyone is getting access to goods and services, people aren't starving or having no place to live. Resilience, however, as a policy goal, has rarely been talked about, but in this moment, where climate change is now beginning to really enter people's top of mind, wildfires, droughts, resilience is something we've got to think about. And transportation, it's important to have resilience. One reason, by the way, I'm opposing this using trains right along I-70 in Colorado, right along the Colorado River through the Glenwood Canyon, using those trains to carry crude oil strikes me as an unsound effort from a resilience perspective, because as you people know, when those corridors get closed because of a train accident and what spills is crude oil, it's incredibly damaging to the ecosystem, to the water. We need to make sure we're asking questions. how are we operating in ways that are truly resilient, truly sustainable? So to answer your question, how do I think about this holistically across all these angles, looking to make sure that we're building resilience into how we set up our transportation, our water systems, our housing systems, and more.
You mentioned climate and climate change. Obviously, that impacts ski resorts and resort communities. If you don't have a cold winter, there's no skiing or snowboarding. Today's, the current federal administration is antagonistic against regulations that try and advance rules that mitigate climate change. How do you think about that in the context of a state government? What can a state government do to, mitigate the impact of climate change? And, what is the federal versus state, sharing responsibility? And how do you think about that? What should be done at the state level to, again, mitigate climate change as much as possible?
First, let me take a minute and allow this to sink in, because what you said, Craig, is not something we should pass over lightly. In the United States of America, we have a unique situation. We have a federal government, unlike any in the developed world, that starts from the premise that climate change is a hoax and isn't happening. There's, for me, a lot of difficulty just to accept that, yes, we're in this world. 70+% of Americans are somewhat or very concerned about climate change. Our government says it's not happening, which means protective measures, like, for example, a methane rule that was developed here in Colorado and adopted by the EPA nationally, is on the chopping block, which means the clean car rules that would govern emissions from automobiles is on the chopping block. First, when these protective measures are on the chopping block, I and other state attorneys general will go to court to make sure that we keep these protections in place. And we've had some success in the first Trump administration. We'll be in court again in this second Trump administration to keep protective measures like the methane rule, like the clean car rule in place. In addition to playing defense, we will continue in Colorado to protect our land, air, and water with rules at the state level. The methane rule that was adopted by the EPA came from a Colorado methane rule limiting methane emissions in oil and gas operations in Colorado. Now, if you're in Wyoming as an operator, and Wyoming has no such rule, we need the EPA's rule to protect air quality and to protect against emissions that are going to come to Colorado. So we need the EPA rule. But as for Colorado, we do have our own rule, and we're developing our own rule on clean water too, because we were fighting for a federal Clean Water Act that was protective, and the Supreme Court gutted it. So we now developed our own Colorado Clean Water Act. We're now implementing it. And we're going to keep asking how to protect our land, air, and water. Colorado depends on these resources. As Attorney General, I'm going to fight for them.
And other initiatives at the state level that should be, again, I'm a New York resident. New York has been pretty good around building out electric charging infrastructure and supporting that both through, tax credits to residents who install them or rebates, I should say, and building out a fast charging network that they've been subsidizing a fair amount. Are there thoughts, whether it's EV charging or other initiatives in terms of industry that the state should be getting involved in, or is this, again, you mentioned Wyoming can do what they want, and carbon and emissions don't know state boundaries, but at the end of the day, the old adage from our childhood was, think globally, act locally. Is there a sense that you need to do that, should you be elected governor?
Well, in Colorado, we are very much at the fore of developing these protections. Go back now close to 20 years, Colorado developed something that was called Renewable Portfolio Standards, where we were pushing to have more renewable energy in our energy mix. And that effort has continued as we look to get away from carbon. And you mentioned electric vehicle charging stations, very important, obviously, to the transition. The federal government, in a series of legislative measures, has called for support of such infrastructure. We're now looking at the reality that we're going to be in court against this current administration, who is seeking to stop funding for things like wildfire resilience funding, for Forest Service workers, and for electric vehicle charging stations. And one of the challenges we've had against the current administration is it doesn't seem to recognize the principle of separation of powers. Congress makes the law, the president carries out the law. This president has said, if I don't like a certain spending on, for example, wildfire resilience and mitigating wildfires, I'm not going to give Colorado the money. If I don't want Forest Service workers helping to fight forest fires, I'm just going to fire them. And we've gone to court to protect workers' jobs, to protect wildfire resilience, and we'll have to be protecting EV charging stations as well.
I guess you're making reference to the Impoundment Act, among other things, that they seem to ignore.
You got more wonky than I did there, Craig. For those at home without a scorecard, the principle is the president doesn't get to rewrite the budget by saying, I'm not going to spend money. That is illegal. The Impoundment Act is the law on point, and it's unconstitutional under the principle of separation of powers.
That's a first where I get more wonky than you, but I'll take it. You mentioned, listen, there's water, there's resiliency. Where I am right now, which is not New York City, I'm in Western Massachusetts. There was a forest fire behind us this past fall, engulfing over 1,000 acres. It encroached a ski area that's also sort of behind me, where they literally had to turn the snowmaking guns on during the fall and spray them into the woods to wet down the forest and to prevent the forest from approaching the ski resort. That led to a slew of other issues down the road. Obviously we were in a drought. That's in part why there was the fire in the first place. But it depleted the water reserves of the ski resort, and so they got a very slow start to the season. Water in New England is somewhat of an afterthought. I mean, at least I don't think of it as all that important, but in Colorado and the West, it's hugely important, and the water rights and riparian law, I haven't used that term in a long time, but is very important, and the compacts and the treaties that go with it. Let's talk about water first at a high level, and how that's governed in the West, like Colorado, and then how does that impact ski resorts and their snowmaking capabilities come wintertime?
Craig, for those of your listeners who live in places like New England where water is plentiful, what I'm about to say could come as a little bit of a revelation. The West has done a remarkable job to develop in a robust way, basically in a desert. When you think about Colorado and the level of precipitation that we get, it is a relatively arid environment. And yet we've built an entire economy with a lot of people living here, with robust agriculture and outdoor recreation, all of which depends on water. And there's a poem in the Colorado State Capitol by Thomas Farrell that says, in Colorado is a land where life is inscribed in water. Water is life. You made a point that I want to pick up a little bit about the interaction between wildfires and water, because we saw this in Grand County. So for those who are, again, ski aficionados, think Winter Park in terms of skiing. Grand County had some terrible, terrible fires. And there are huge reservoirs up there. And one of the concerns, when you have wildfires and it creates a lot of ash, you can undermine the water quality because of the wildfire. So just play this painful story through. You have the wildfire, which is costly to property, in some cases human life. you're forced to use the water, like you mentioned, to fight the wildfire during a drought, and then you compromise the water by having these sorts of ash and other pollutants from the fire. A triple threat, which means if we're not creating resilient systems up front to protect the quality of our water, to safeguard against wildfires, and to manage our water in a resilient way, we're going to see a potentially vicious cycle where this precious resource, our water, is not available. You made another point I want to lift up, and then maybe I'll let you jump in with further questions because we can go really deep and wonky on this topic. Because water is so precious in Colorado, it is heavily regulated through a series of property rights, and you mentioned compacts governing who has access to what water, when, and how. The Colorado River Compact involves 7 states and Mexico. And you have upper basin states who get half the water from the Colorado River. That would be Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Utah. Lower basin states, think California, Arizona, and Nevada, get the other half of this water from the river, and Mexico as well. And some of that water, people are wondering what's the connection here, gets diverted even over the mountains. So you have water from what we call the western slope of Colorado coming to support people living in Colorado Springs or Denver. How we manage this water is crucial to our future. And in the best version of our future, we are working together collaboratively, creatively, in how we conserve water, how we reuse it, how we protect it, how we make it adaptable, how we store it. In the worst version, we're all fighting each other within Colorado and within the surrounding states.
And now to tie that into the ski resorts and ski areas, so this winter I went to Utah. You can boo me later. And it was interesting. One of the resorts that I was skiing at, they were talking about a new development and the snowmaking, and that you could see the reservoir, not just a ski resort reservoir, a reservoir for the community, for the state, where they drew and paid for the water to run the snowmaking. And the interesting stat that was shared with me was that roughly 80 to 90% of the snowpack in this new development area ran back into the reservoir, come springtime and summer. And so at least there is this cycle of replenishment, right? So snowmaking isn't per se negative, but it does draw significant resources from water sources. And again, with climate change or precipitation changes, droughts, ski resorts are going to have to draw upon the local water stores to make snow as opposed to use the natural snow. How do they fit into that bigger picture, which is a lot of competing interests for a very precious resource?
I want to start with one background fact. I am old enough that I can remember in the 1990s when I was in Colorado in the summer, you would go hiking in the mountains that people ski on in the winter, and you would see snow in July and August. In fact, there are people, you probably had some people on your show who are proud of the fact they ski every month of the year. And that's possible because there's snow in parts of Colorado 12 months of the year. But I'll tell you, there's a lot less snow now than there was 30 years ago. And that's relevant for water because it used to be that our natural storage of water were these mountains. And the runoff that would be continuous. The problem with climate change is you lose that natural storage and you have more, you'll hear this word a lot in the climate community, in the water community, you'll have a lot more evaporation. Sometimes people use the word system loss, which means we have less water. And we have more people and more demands on water. And then to make plain what I think people understand, we can't deficit finance water. If we want water for snowmaking, for our skiing, we want it for our drinking, we want it for our rivers and outdoor rec, and we want it for our agriculture, and we have less of it, that is a tough equation. Which means we need real planning, kind of like we do for housing and transportation infrastructure, so that we're using our water in smart ways, we're storing it in smart ways, and we're all adapting to the reality in the West, whether it's Utah or Colorado, that water is a very precious resource. And one of the challenges we have is a societal change around that reality, which could mean, for example, people are, like we're doing in our home, xeriscaping their home. You don't want to have grass that is taking up water when you don't need it. Or maybe you're planting rye instead of alfalfa, which uses a lot more water, and so on.
And so again, the ski areas are going to need to work within that framework. I mean, I think at least in their favor is that they're not huge depleters. I don't know what the right word is, but at the end of the day, the snowpack.
Yeah, the question is the use one that exhausts the water, or is, as you put it well, does most of the water kind of return flows? And you're right, and you gave a number that, when you make snow out of water and it melts, it goes back into the system. One of the questions as we keep looking at other uses is how much are we consuming the water so that it's not available versus how much is it going back into the system? Because ideally we keep reusing all the water we can.
Right. So another thing that unfortunately ski resorts have to think about and plan for as they develop and as again climate changes. We also touched on, you mentioned that many of the ski resorts are on public land. They may own the base area, but by and large, the further up the trails you go, the more likely it becomes that you're on public land. I think in Colorado, and correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of that is U.S. Forest Service land, as opposed to state-owned. But how does that work from a land use regulatory perspective, and also again the other impacts and making sure that as skiers and snowboarders, outdoor sports lovers, we continue to have access to these public lands for enjoyment and respite, the things that you talked about early on about being able to relax and decompress when you go skiing.
This is a really important point, Craig, which is we get to enjoy public lands in Colorado as part of how we live, and the appreciation for public lands as a Colorado value, 80+% Coloradans value our public lands. And one of the challenges we have now with the current administration, cutting back on the workers in the Forest Service, both hits us from the wildfire perspective, which is having less people addressing wildfire risk and fighting wildfires, but also potentially less people allowing us to have access to public lands. We're worried about whether our national parks are going to be accessible for people to go to. With respect to the leases that the ski resorts get, they have certain responsibilities to be a good steward on these lands and to protect those ecosystems. We had one case that we brought against Vail Resorts under our Natural Resources Damages Authority. This is under a federal law. I'll give you the acronym called CERCLA. And the challenge is if you have any harm to local ecosystems that could kill fish in the river, for example, we will take action. There will be funds that will then be paid to remediate those harms. And that's what happened in this case I mentioned involving Vail. So we'll continue to ensure that ski operators are good actors, continue to honor their stewardship responsibilities, and we in Colorado are going to be vigilant to protect our public lands. One of the threats that is apparently out there is, are we going to see ending public lands, either ending access to public lands or trying to privatize public lands or not be a good steward of public lands? Colorado won't have any of that.
And how do you step in to prevent that from happening?
Unfortunately, we're going to have to look at litigation to the extent that we see a violation of the basic requirements and responsibilities that the executive branch has. This is a matter that we know people in Colorado and the United States of America care deeply about. We don't believe there will be a willingness to take our public lands and undermine them or sell them off or limit people's access to it. So we're going to keep fighting for access to public lands and to protect them.
So you mentioned Vail Resorts, and in the same breath, CERCLA, which a term I haven't heard since law school. Clearly, I'm not practicing in that realm. Look, Vail Resorts or Alterra Mountain Resort or the other ski company operators can often be partners, I imagine. They are, at the end of the day, they want to promote an outdoor product, skiing and snowboarding and the outdoor lifestyle. And obviously they may make missteps, in which case it may lead to a lawsuit. How do you think about the operators of ski resorts in terms of the partnership opportunities? Because in my mind, they, while having a profit motive, admittedly, their product is an outdoor one and relies on people's desire to spend time outdoors in nature.
The good news, and it's important for Colorado, that the outdoor recreation economy, and you could add hiking, or you could add ice climbing, or you could add kayaking, et cetera, fishing. That whole industry depends on the protection of our land, air, and water. So from a stewardship perspective, there is an ethic within the industry that this economy depends on how we protect our natural resources. The rules and protections in place are understood as enabling a vibrant outdoor recreation economy, which obviously skiing is a big part of in Colorado. And so that's an important foundation to build this partnership on. And then insofar as there's questions about whether a company broke the rules or not, there are legal processes to evaluate it. The case I mentioned, Vail pretty quickly said, yeah, we made a mistake here. We're going to fix it. And that's what I will always ask companies to do, which is if we find something happen that is harmful to natural resources or harmful to consumers, we will sit down and we'll say, what's your side of the story? And sometimes a company will say, our side is we made a mistake. We're going to fix it and make it right.
It's good to hear. With the limited time we have left, what else would you want to share or think listeners should know about in terms of the ski industry economy, if you will, in Colorado, or just the protection of the environment that skiers and snowboarders are dependent upon?
I'm going to make 2 points that I want to talk about, totally separate. One about the economy, one about society. On the economy, when I went to work at the antitrust division of the Justice Department almost 30 years ago, one of the cases I worked on was Vail acquiring a number of mountains. So for those who know Colorado, Vail is not only in Vail and Beaver Creek, but Vail also owns Breckenridge and also owns a number of other mountains that are in Summit County, including Keystone.
Keystone, yeah, I was going to.
Yeah. And Vail wanted to also buy Arapahoe Basin, fondly known as A Basin. And the Justice Department with the state of Colorado 30 years ago brought a case saying, no, you can buy Keystone, you can buy Breckenridge, but you can't buy A Basin. And one of the questions that's going to continue to be asked in skiing is there too much concentration? And what's the role of antitrust? And there's another famous case from the 1980s involving Aspen, where one company owned 3 of the mountains, another owned the 4th mountain, and the one who owned the 3 used to have a 4-mountain pass where they cooperate with the 4th mountain, and then they stopped making that available on a dime, and the goal was to force the other one out of business. And they wouldn't even take cash coupons from the 4th mountain. And the Supreme Court heard that case and said that was a violation of the antitrust laws. And so my final point on the economics of skiing is to make sure that ski mountains, ski companies are operating fairly and not violating the antitrust laws, either by merging to a point where they have a market position that they can exercise some level of control, or conduct either on their own or with rivals that undermines competition. So that's an area to keep an eye on of how we protect competition in the skiing industry.
And I want to jump in there because we think of Vail and Altera as the big behemoths who have bought up a number of resorts across the country and elsewhere. This can happen locally. And I just really quickly, there's a ski area operator outside of Syracuse, New York, who owned two areas, Song and Labrador, purchased another area called Toggenburg and immediately shut it down with a view to forcing consumers to go to the two resorts that he was operating. I just read in the newspaper that a judge took the owner to task, and I don't know what it's going to happen, but this can happen at the at a smaller market level. Antitrust, again, wonky, gets into what is the market and defining that market. And so it can be national in scale, it can be statewide, Colorado, or it could be the Syracuse market, depending upon the circumstances. So excellent point, and has impact across the country.
We can have a whole other conversation about antitrust law.
Yeah.
But I want to get to, before we close, the societal point. And I had a chance to speak recently to a group that was having a gathering in Silverton, which is a beautiful part of our state, down in San Juan County, which is getting close to the southwest part of our state. And they are a group that sponsors young people getting out on the slopes and creating relationships with one another. And we talked about this at the beginning, Craig, whether you're on the chair with someone else, whether you're learning how to ski, being with other people, particularly during those crucial teenage years, is something that we are paying a lot of attention to, because one of the things I'm seeing in our society is more kids spending more time on their phones, going down dark holes, not getting outdoors, not being with one another, not building relationships with mentors who can help coach them and help them develop. And programs like the one I mentioned play a crucial role in helping kids develop, I'll use this word again, in a resilient way. Because young people right now are facing mental health challenges on an order that we've not seen before. Social media is a big part of it. Obviously, the pandemic was. One of the ways we're going to help young people live their best lives is get outdoors, be with one another, build healthy relationships, build better resilience.
Couldn't agree with you more. And perhaps you'll take this up with another Colorado resident, Michaela Schifrin, who recently dedicated some of her 100th win sort of press to the Share Winter Foundation, which is attempting to do just what you say, which is get children who tend to come from marginalized communities out into winter sports, whatever it may be, whether it's skiing or Nordic skiing or jumping or ice skating, what have you, with an idea towards doing exactly what you just said. So I see a collaboration in the future. Attorney General, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today on Fresh Corduroy. It's been great chatting with you. I look forward to seeing what you do in the governor's race. And again, thank you so much for the wonkiest conversation of the podcast yet.
Well, I hope that your listeners hung in there with us, hopefully raised some questions, whether it's water, antitrust law, or dealing with the challenges of climate change. There's a lot on our agenda in the Attorney General's office. There's a lot that Colorado's thinking about, and all of it, as we talked about, is very relevant to any skier out there. So please get educated, get engaged. We need you.
Thank you again. All right. Take care.
Thanks, Dan.
If you're listening to me now, you are just as interested in the policy issues facing the ski and snowboard industry as I am. I hope you appreciated AG Weiser's thoughtful responses to the questions on housing, the environment, infrastructure, water rights, and public lands. These issues touch our pastime and need to be addressed if we want to continue enjoying the outdoors as we have and pass that joy on to our children and grandchildren. I also like the point the AG raised at the end, which is we can do a lot of societal good if we can encourage and enable more children to be able to participate in skiing and snowboarding. With that, keep enjoying the Fresh Corduroy where you can. Please follow the podcast wherever you listen so that you'll be notified of new episodes, and it also helps spread the word. See you next time. Music is by Eric Zolan from his album Calder's Universe and can be found on Spotify.